In this short video, we're going to be painting a portrait using some direct Alla Prima techniques. Roll that intro. Well, I've been getting stuck into so many waves and landscapes recently that I thought it was high time that we produce a portrait video for you, and I share with you some direct Alla Prima portrait painting techniques. Now, in a lot of my landscape demos, especially with painting plein air, I talk about the importance of working from direct observation. When we're painting a portrait, that's no different. Sometimes working from direct life can really help inform our studio painting practice. This is all about making those snap judgments and trying to mix that color that we see, and this really is great for honing what we're able to do with our palette. It's all about mixing that color. So in this demonstration, I'm going to be painting my buddy Wayne, and he has just got a fantastic look. I had him come to the studio, we set him up in a pose that was very similar to something I saw on his Instagram, which was so inspiring that I decided to recreate this situation, and I lit it in the studio using natural light supplemented with a spotlight halogen, and then recreated it from life, working in about a 3-hour time window. I've condensed the painting process down to about 8 to 10 minutes for you here, but if you want to see the full version of this demonstration, then check it out on Patreon. It's live right now, and that link you'll find in the description down below. Now, in this painting demonstration, I really wanted to put the Tisch dagger to the test. Yes, that's right. I've got my own paintbrush named after me, made by Rosemary Co. It's ridiculous, but it's also awesome. And it is actually, in point of fact, my favorite brush to use. Link is down below. But I wanted to really put this brush to the test and see how far could I go with this brush in creating this Alla Prima portrait. So, we've got our model, we've got the setup, let's get painting. I'm working on Belgian linen that is stretched around a 16 by 20 hardboard frame. Now I've pre-washed this with a light coat of burnt umber and then rub this back, leaving the warm tone that you see here. And I begin sketching up Wayne on the panel here using quinacridone magenta and burnt umber. I begin just locating exactly where he's going to be on the canvas before worrying about any of those individual facial features. And here I'm just knocking them in. All of these lines that are forming the construction of the portrait will be completely obliterated when I start blocking in with color. I'm taking a slightly different approach with this painting than I would normally. Here, I decided to block in the background and the shirt with some nice dark tone so that I had something to contrast those lighter skin tones against. So I just began working in that background with a very broad 1-inch Tisch dagger brush. Now this is pretty much just a combination of burnt umber and ultramarine blue, but I'm going to sneak in a little bit of burnt sienna and quinacridone magenta as well, just for interest.
See, I pulled a sneaky on you.
I mix in more ultramarine blue into the shirt area, making this tone a bit blacker, and I'll come back and layer again over the top of these chunky brush marks just to add more dynamic interest to the background. But for now, I just want a nice dark tone loosely painted to provide that contrast that I'm looking for. Now we've isolated Wayne, his head and his beard as a shape, just floating in space. Time to map out some of these skin tones. I've got a slightly smaller Tisch dagger brush here, and I'm going to be mixing in some of that white, which is a combination of 50-50 titanium and Kremnitz white, and then kicking this a notch with burnt umber, burnt sienna, and transparent yellow oxide. Now, transparent yellow oxide is fantastic for skin tones, and this in conjunction with permanent crimson is just dynamite for creating that warmth and that flush that glows through the skin. I balance some of these warmer tones out with ultramarine blue, quinacridone magenta, and cobalt teal. Some of these cooler skin tones get added to the top of the head, just rounding out the form. I try to map out the portrait with big, broad tiles of color, thinking about the planes of the face as they catch the light or form a shadow. Areas like the nose, cheeks, and eye sockets get a touch more permanent crimson and transparent yellow oxide. Now there's no right or wrong way to go about this, but I begin by mapping out those mid to lighter tones first before attempting to knock in the shadows. And again, I'm working zone to zone and edge to edge, just as I would with a landscape, bringing these masses of color together and blending slightly between these zones. This allows me to create cleaner color and move faster. So an example of one of those zones is this eye socket here, which I just left as bare canvas and then came back in with that darker tone. And now I gradually adjust those tones a little bit darker here and there, just sculpting this form. Because I'm using Liquid Original for my medium, it's starting to set up a tack after about an hour to two, which means I can have a moderate amount of layering within the first sitting. I don't use too much medium though, only about 25%, or 1 part medium to 4 parts paint. Now I begin to map out some of these deeper shadows in the beard, and I'm using a bigger Tischler brush and mixing in burnt umber, burnt sienna, and ultramarine blue. And for some of the lighter grayer areas, I just add a touch more white. I really enjoy using that 50-50 mix of white, half Kremnitz, half titanium. It gives me a bit of opacity given by that titanium, but enough of the structural integrity provided by the Kremnitz. And of course, lead white is one of the most archival whites we can use. And if you have any questions at all about the materials that I'm using, you can always find links to those in the description down below. Please excuse this short interruption. You might have already heard me mention this at the start of this video, but right now, the full version of this demonstration is live on my Patreon page, and you can access that by clicking the link in the description down below. There, we're going to do a deep dive into the materials, the process, and you're going to get to see a fuller version of this oil painting demonstration. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, make sure you click that link in the description down below. Now, let's get back to painting. Now all up, this painting took me about 3 hours, working totally from life. And at the point you're seeing the painting now, this is at about the 1 hour mark. I start off very loose in general, mapping out those big, broad shapes, making sure that I've got a correct form before I start thinking about detail. And I'll be able to apply a moderate amount of detail during this sitting. I use a touch more of that white and brush it through some of the wet paint in the direction of the hair to provide some more of that gray coming through in the sideburns and the mustache. I start to use the 1/4 inch dagger to apply some finer marks now, using just the blade of the brush, applying some wrinkles and then going back and adjusting some of these strokes. As the paint is still wet, I can go back and apply a moderate amount of blending, rounding out some of the forms and just making sure that one feature flows into the next. Now, if you've been watching my channel for a little while, you would have heard me, no doubt, talk about the Tischler brush. It's not just my favorite brush because it's got my name on it. It is actually a really handy brush to use, just due to the variety of the shapes and strokes that we can make, using either the broad blade of the brush, that fine tip, or that flat edge, so we can form a fine point, a broad stroke, or a nice straight sharp line. And because it's bristle, it actually forms some really painterly strokes. And this demo you're watching now was painted almost exclusively with these brushes. Now I don't have black on the palette, instead I'm using a combination of ultramarine blue and burnt umber. So I deepen the tone considerably and start laying in some darker marks around the eyes, forming the pupil, the eyelashes, and some of those deeper crevices. I'm also adding just a touch of warmth given by that permanent crimson. There's more warmth showing on that highlight side of the face, just in that eye socket, Wayne's right eye, and that's allowing for some of those skin tones to really start to glow. Now on these highlights, where we're getting some light shining off the surface of the skin, provided by that open skylight above, I have more coolness coming through. So I've added some white, and I've just kicked this a notch with quinacridone magenta and cobalt teal. I really enjoy that contrast given by warm and cool, and I think it makes for a dynamic, interesting portrait. With just some small amounts of paint on the ends of those bristles, I feather in some color very lightly, just adjusting some of the tones here and there and making sure I've achieved the right form. And it's at this point that I start to really pay attention to each element of the face in isolation, going from one eye to the next, to the nose, to the lips, just making sure we've achieved a likeness. Once everything's in the right place, generally, it then just becomes a matter of fine-tuning. I deepen some of the tones in the background to provide even more contrast, and I knock this in with a broad 1-inch dagger brush, mixing in ultramarine blue with that burnt umber. The surface has already started to set up that tack, so it's accepting some fresh paint, and I'm going along with just the ends of those bristles, applying some lighter, finer white hair just growing through that beard, and brushing this down in the direction that the hair is growing. By applying these strokes rather lightly, it does give the indication and texture of hair. I decide to add just a touch more light shining on that high-lit edge, and I'm applying some very fine strokes now with an Eclipse long filbert. I always save those brightest tones for the very end. These highlights are a combination of white and cadmium lemon. Now there is one more kind of mark that we can make with a dagger brush, and that's by turning the brush around and scraping through using the handle to provide more texture in that beard. And the very last stroke I'll add is a tiny little highlight glinting off the eye. Well, I really hope that you've enjoyed this short little video. I must say, I'm quite pleased with the final result, and I'm really happy with the way those daggers handled in the end. They were giving me that speed and that accuracy and keeping those marks nice and fresh. And if you want to find out about those brushes, then again, you can find links to the materials in the description down below. Now, if you want even more exclusive content and take your paintings even further, then make sure you check out my Patreon page. The full version of this tutorial is there live right now. And a huge thank you to all of my patrons on Patreon. Thank you so much for making this work possible. Thank you so much for joining me here in the studio. It has been a blast sharing this bit of time with you. I really look forward to being with you again in another painting video. Until then, so long.